to talk also about the prevention of allergies through early nutrition. The question is allergy still a problem? Sí or no? Sí. In Europe, 1 out of every 20 children has one or more of food allergies, so there is a lot of discussion about that. And you can try to estimate what is the risk if you know the history, family history, and you know that the highest risk is always to have two parents especially, but with the same kind of allergy. So if, for example, 2 young people go to the asthma camp, or something like that, and they return already not 2 but 3 of them, then the risk is already 60 to 80%. And everyone who has an allergy, of course, wants to reduce this risk of allergies, especially severe allergy. They want to reduce this risk, and they are asking about, are there any interventions to reduce the risk of allergy? And there is a number of early nutritional strategies, which I summarized here, and let me discuss some of them. But first of all, is prevention possible? And I already cited this, the great strategy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis on an ugly fact. And again, this is the evidence that I would like to discuss. So first of all, let me discuss breastfeeding and allergy. And in the literature, you can find whatever you want. You find there is no association, a reduced risk, and an increased risk. The most recent systematic review published in The Lancet last year shows there is no reduction, but you can find whatever you want in the literature. So the issue remains controversial, and you may ask why there are inconsistent results. And there is a number of reasons why there are inconsistent results. For example, not everyone takes into account confounding factors such as gender, age. For example, to make a reliable diagnosis of asthma, you need to have a child who is at least 5, 6 years old. Socioeconomic status, family history of atopy, parental smoking, presence of furry animal at the home, recruitment and reporting biases which may have. If you ask me what I have eaten for dinner 2 days ago, well, I know that I have eaten it, but to know all the details might be remembered. If you ask parents about mothers about breastfeeding, I mean, unless you do it on the same day, I mean, it's very difficult. Inability to randomize, there is no ethics committee which agreed to randomize infants to be breastfed or formula fed. Many studies do not make distinction between exclusive breastfeeding and any breastfeeding. If I ask here in this audience, what does it mean exclusive breastfeeding, unless you remember by heart WHO definition, then it might be differently defined. Imprecise definitions and reverse causality. Infants at the highest risk of allergy might be breastfed for longer periods, and then it may be interpreted that longer breastfeeding is responsive for allergy. So there's a lot of things why there are inconsistent results. So what to advise? And exclusive, despite all the differences, exclusive or full breastfeeding in all infants for about 6 months is a desirable goal. We already discussed that it's not always possible and what not to do, and breastfeeding is not possible. And I would briefly discuss use of dietary products with reduced allergenicity. There is a differentiation between partially hydrolyzed and extensively hydrolyzed formula, which is totally arbitrary, as you know. And the reason is there is no consensus on a cutoff. There is no agreement on the criteria on which to base this classification, and this is because the process of degree of hydrolysis is in fact a continuum between the intact protein at one end and amino acids at the other end. So no agreement. So I think that each hydrolyzed formula should be evaluated separately. So what is the evidence for hydrolyzed formula? This is a BMJ analysis, meta-analysis published last year by Robert Boyle, which added to this discussion, because the conclusion here was that there's no consistent evidence to support the use of hydrolyzed formula for the prevention of allergic disease. Allow me to comment on this meta-analysis. There were various types of partially and extensively hydrolyzed formulas pulled together within each group, but without looking at the different manufacturing processes. Various study designs were pulled together, like, for example, randomized, but also observational studies, studies in which additional interventions were applied, such as house dust mite control measures and a smoke-free environment were included. Age of assessment, the reviewers, and they absolutely have this right to do it, They assess it at 0 to 4, 5 to 4, and above 15 years of age. When you do it, you can do it as a reviewer, but when you are doing systematic review meta-analysis. But if you do it, very often it's not exactly the same time intervals as they were reported by the authors of original trials. So there's a number of decisions that need to be made as to which data should be used for this analysis. And what I think is important, not all hydrolyzed formulas provide the same degree of protective benefit, and factors such as a protein source, hydrolysis method, and degree of hydrolysis that often depend on the manufacturer contribute to the difference among hydrolysis. So I think that each hydrolyzed formula should be evaluated separately. So together with my colleague, we look at one type of partially hydrolyzed formula, which was a partially hydrolyzed 100% whey formula, and we did it according to the Cochrane methodology, and I just show you the results. And the results in our intention to treat analysis, infants who were exclusively breastfed were included, and there were included, this analysis included infants who were never exposed to this formula, and there were reduced risk of eczema that were statistically significant for some, albeit not all time points, and exactly the same per protocol analysis, but per protocol analysis includes all participants who adhere adequately to the assigned regimen. So you see there were differences in this meta-analysis. Per protocol analysis, please remember there is a caution is needed, you lose the beauty of randomization with this analysis. But anyway, if you want to understand, if you look at this recent meta-analysis, and there is one which is ongoing Cochrane review. If you follow the literature, you know that it was published, but it was recently withdrawn because there was some error. But you will see that there are some controversies. The findings are not consistent. And then the question is, would you recommend hydrolyzed formula if there are no consistent results of the meta-analysis? And I did try to show you very briefly what is the explanation why the results are not consistent. You may ask, okay, like Oscar Wilde, when I was young, I thought that money was the most important thing in life. Now that I'm old, I know that it's true. And it's usually money behind it, of course, but the important is it cost effective if you are using hydrolyzed formula? And again, I'm showing you just a summary of few meta-analysis or cost-effective analysis that show that they are effective. So again, the question is, would you recommend hydrolyzed formula to prevent allergy when you know it is cost-effective? And they might be different answers. Until very recently, all recommendations were quite consistent. Now different opinion exists, and now if you look at the recommendation, they differ. And the reason behind is because there are differences in the interpretation of the evidence. So it's very likely that in your country the discussion also continues and probably will continue, but I did try you to tell what is, again, what is the reason why the interpretation may be different. Early versus delayed introduction of complementary foods and potentially allergenic foods, I already discussed it just very briefly. Potentially allergenic foods, we already know that recommendations agree that it was based on observational trials, and you know that we have this randomized control trial. It takes time to have these randomized control trials, because not only that you have to start the study, to enroll patients, usually the follow-up is until 5-6 years of age, then you have to analyze data, agree on this data, so that's why it takes such a long time. But we are lucky we do have it. I already showed you this meta-analysis very briefly, so once again, if you look at early egg introduction, 5 randomized control trials, early versus late introduction, more than 1,900 participants, relative risk 0.56. So with this early introduction, you reduce the risk of egg allergy by 44%. So it shows you that there is a really substantial reduction. Peanut allergy already discussed, the LEAP study, and EAT study, all of them different population. One is a high-risk population, another is a general population. 2 randomized control trials, reduction by 71%. For cow's milk, there was no significant difference. And I already showed you how it translates into the recommendation. They might be different, slightly different, I would say, weighting of this, or stressing of this recommendation in various countries, depending whether or not this is a country where there is a high risk of peanut allergy or not. But generally, allergenic foods, potentially allergenic foods, may be introduced at the same time as any other complementary food. And for infants at high risk of peanut allergy, peanuts should be introduced early, following evaluation by appropriately trained specialists. I already mentioned in my previous talk that in countries when this is a huge risk, like for example in the United States, they develop the whole guidelines, how to do it, how to perform skin prick tests, etc. So this is something that you have to follow if this is a problem in your country. And there are recommended approaches for evaluation of children with severe eczema and or egg allergy before peanut introduction. Probiotics for reducing the risk of allergic diseases, again, one of these controversial issues. Until very recently, the societies were quite consistent saying no recommendation. But 2 years ago, the World Allergy Organization, based on almost the same data as previously, as 2012, they concluded that when it comes to eczema, there is likely net benefit from using probiotics, resulting in the reduction of eczema. And indeed, if you look at all probiotics taken together, there was reduction by 28%, but the question was which probiotic to use, when to start, when to stop. And if you look at individual trials, you will see that only one probiotic, that was Lactobacillus GG, that was studied in more than one randomized controlled trials. But even with this one probiotic studied in more than one randomized controlled trial, there was no significant difference. Together with my colleagues from ESPEGAN, we wrote a letter to the editor saying that recommendations on probiotic in allergy prevention, or I would say in any indication, should not be based on pulling data from different strains. What is new this year in pediatrics, there was a new randomized control trial published with Lactobacillus GG, and I added this study to the analysis which I showed you previously, and again, Lactobacillus GG is a candidate, but more studies are still needed. This was negative study, I did not mention it, but important study with 2 years follow-up, so important study. So controversies are which probiotics to use, when to start, when to stop. At the moment, we don't have a good candidate, frankly speaking. For prebiotics, should prebiotics be used? World Allergy Organization published this document last year. For pregnant women, for breastfeeding mothers, and exclusively breastfed infants, there is no recommendation, or it's not recommended. But if you look at non-exclusively breastfed infants, yes, there's conditional recommendation with very low certainty of the evidence. And if you look at the benefits, you will see that, frankly speaking, there was only for asthma or recurrent wheezing that was really statistically significant and with very wide confidence intervals. So here, that's why we are saying it's a low, very weak recommendation. But again, which prebiotic to use, when to start, when to stop. And again, it was not stated clearly in the guidelines, but if you look at individual trials, in 15 out of 18 included studies, it was a mixture of FOS and GOS. So just one step further, and then we would know which prebiotic or prebiotics to use. So what to advise when it comes to allergy prevention? I would say exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months is a desired goal. For protein hydrolysates, yes, only formulas with documented effects should be used. And at least in Europe, we are very much relying on the Gini study. I'm sure you are aware of the Gini study, German Infant Nutritional Intervention Study. For introduction of complementary food, allergenic foods may be introduced when complementary feeding is commenced anytime after 4 months. I showed you there's a number of weeks when you can start introduction of complementary feeding, so it doesn't have to start at the same time in all children. And if a mother wants to breastfeed for 6 months, there is still time to introduce complementary feeding. And in countries where peanut allergy is common, the early peanut consumption starting from 4 to 10 months is recommended. If this is a problem in your country. In my country, this is not a problem, so we do not follow this recommendation unless we have a child with severe eczema, allergy or severe eczema. For prebiotics and probiotics, I already mentioned what are the controversies and why we cannot routinely recommend at the moment. And my final comment is science. Science never solves a problem without creating 10 more. Thank you very much for your attention.